April 29th, 1945. A forest road outside Althatting, Germany. The air smelled of wet pine and diesel. Ilona felt the rough wool of her greatcoat collar scratching her jaw, a familiar irritation in a world suddenly devoid of familiar things. Her breath plumed white, then vanished. A man's voice, speaking a language she knew only from propaganda films, cut through the quiet. The words were flat, without the snarling cadence the newsreels had promised. She kept her eyes on the muddy ground, on the way the dark soil clung to the boots of the woman in front of her. A small stone was lodged in the boot's heel. She focused on the stone, on its precise shape, its grayness. Her rifle had been taken 5 minutes ago. The motion had been impersonal, efficient, the American soldier barely meeting her eyes as he took the weapon. He had stacked it with others in a neat pile by the roadside, a cordwood of surrendered arms. Her hands felt empty, light. She curled them in a fist inside her pockets, her knuckles pressing against the cold metal of a single, useless bullet she had kept. There was no shouting, no blows. This absence of violence was its own kind of pressure, a vacuum that pulled at her nerves. She had rehearsed a different scene in her mind for months. A scene of heroic last stands, or of brutal final moments. She had prepared her body for pain, her mind for defiance. She was not prepared for this quiet, orderly dismantling of her world. The American guard gestured with his rifle, not at her but at the column. A simple economic motion. Move. The column of women, 200 of them in mismatched uniforms and civilian coats, shuffled forward. They were nurses, signal operators, clerks. The logistical tale of a phantom army. Ilona risked a glance at the soldier. He was young, younger than her brother. His face was smooth, his expression one of profound boredom. He was chewing, a slow, rhythmic grinding of his jaw. The sight was so mundane, so profoundly out of place that it felt like a hallucination. Her stomach clenched, a tight knot of hunger and fear. The last of the hard bread had been gone for 2 days. The man spat. A brown stream hit the dirt. He adjusted the strap of his rifle and continued chewing. Ilona looked back at the ground. The woman in front of her stumbled, and for a heart-stopping second, Ilona thought the bored soldier would act, that the mask would drop, revealing the monster she had been taught to expect. Instead, another American, an older one with lines around his eyes, stepped forward and steadied the woman by her elbow. He said something. The tone was not unkind. He released her, and the column kept moving. The air was cold. The trees dripped with moisture. The only sounds were the squelch of boots in mud and the low, incomprehensible murmur of the guards' voices. A world was ending, not with a bang, but with a quiet, administrative rustle. She could not reconcile the terror her government had promised with the tired indifference she saw on the faces of her captors. The feeling was not relief. It was a deep, unsettling confusion, a disorientation that was colder and more invasive than the forest air. The forest road was not a destination. It was a conduit. For Ilona and the other 217 women of her unit, it was the entry point into a system they could not yet comprehend. They were the remnants of the Royal Hungarian Army's Auxiliary Corps, swept up in the final, chaotic collapse of the German southern flank. For weeks, they had been retreating, moving west across Austria and into Bavaria, driven by a singular, primal fear, the advancing Red Army. Every rumor, every whispered story from the east, painted a picture of Soviet occupation that was apocalyptic for women. The stories were of mass rape, of summary executions, of brutality as a tool of conquest. So they ran west. They ran toward the Americans, an enemy they knew only through caricature and state-sponsored hatred, but who were, crucially, not the Russians. Now, the unknown had arrived, and it was taking the form of paperwork. They were marched from the forest to a hastily established collection point in a farmer's field. Here, the scale of the Allied operation began to reveal itself. It wasn't just them. Thousands of soldiers were being processed. Hungarians, Germans, even a few bewildered Italians. The sheer logistical mass of it all was stunning. Trucks, dozens of them, were lined up. Field kitchens were being assembled, their metal components glinting in the weak afternoon sun. Men with clipboards moved through the crowds of prisoners, their movements purposeful. Margaret, a nurse who had spent the last 2 years stitching wounds with dwindling supplies, watched this process with a professional's eye. She saw not an army, but an organization. The chaos of surrender was being methodically sorted into order. The material stakes of their former lives, a crust of bread, a clean bandage, a dry place to sleep, were being replaced by a new set of terms dictated by their captors. The immediate risks had changed. The threat was no longer a sniper's bullet or an artillery shell, but something more abstract. It was the risk of being lost in the bureaucracy, of being sent to the wrong camp, of ceasing to be a person and becoming a data point on a form. Zofia, a telegraphist who thought in patterns of code and signal, saw it differently. She watched the American radio operators with their headsets, their fingers flying across keypads. She saw the endless spools of wire, the antennas rising from the command vehicles. It was a network, a web of information flowing with an ease and volume she could barely imagine. Her own unit's radio had been powered by a hand-cranked generator for the last month. This was a different species of power. The women were separated from the male prisoners, not with any ceremony or explanation, but as a simple matter of classification. They were directed toward a separate, smaller enclosure, marked by a simple rope line. This small act of administrative sorting had profound consequences. It created a buffer. It made them a distinct category, a specific problem to be managed. They huddled together, the familiarity of each other's faces a small anchor in the vast, impersonal sea of the surrender. They were no longer soldiers in a national army. They were a special category of human inventory, waiting to be processed, counted, and moved. The cold of the day was seeping into their bones, a damp, persistent chill that their worn coats could no longer repel. Hunger was a constant, low-grade ache, but the overwhelming sensation was one of irrelevance. They were a footnote in a much larger story, a logistical complication for the victors. The power that now controlled their lives did not seem to hate them. It did not seem to feel anything about them at all. The core tension was not between good and evil, but between two entirely different models of reality. On one side was the world the women had been prepared for, a world of ideological hatred and personal violence. On the other was the world they were now experiencing, a world of logistical processes and systemic indifference. The contrast played out in a series of tangible, repeatable moments. First, there was the contrast of sound. The propaganda films had been filled with the enemy's guttural screams, the harsh, barking orders of monstrous commanders. The reality was the low, conversational murmur of the American GIs. They spoke to each other in relaxed tones. Their orders to the prisoners were often simple gestures, a point of the finger, a nod of the head. Zofia, whose ear was trained for the nuances of transmission, noticed that the cadence of their language was not aggressive. It was tired. It was bureaucratic. Second, there was the contrast of gaze. The women had been taught that the enemy would look at them with lust and contempt, that their bodies would be the spoils of war. Instead, the guards' eyes mostly slid past them. They were looked at but not seen. When a guard's gaze did linger, it was often with a look of simple, uncomprehending curiosity, the way one might look at a strange animal at a zoo. It was profoundly depersonalizing. A young woman named Eva, who was barely 18, found this more unsettling than a leer. To be an object of hatred was still to be a subject. To be an object of mild curiosity was to be nothing at all. Third, the contrast of tools. The Hungarian army had been running on fumes, its equipment worn, its supplies anemic. Margaret the nurse could inventory the lack from memory, the reused bandages, the diluted iodine, the single scalpel she had sharpened on a stone until it was thin as a leaf. The Americans, by contrast, were a walking display of material surplus. Every soldier had his own mess kit. Their medical pouches were full. Their weapons were clean and well-maintained. The sheer quantity of things, of cigarettes, of canned goods, of vehicles that worked, spoke to a power that had nothing to do with fighting spirit and everything to do with industrial production. The American army had a standard issue for everything. About 2.5 million vehicles were produced for the U.S. Army during the war. This fact was not known to the women, but they saw its truth in every Jeep that bounced past, every truck that rumbled by, laden with supplies. Finally, there was the contrast of action. They had expected cruelty, a deliberate infliction of suffering. What they received was a process. They were lined up. They were counted. Their names were taken down, phonetically and often incorrectly, by a clerk who seemed deeply bored by his job. The procedure was the same for everyone. It was methodical, unhurried, and utterly devoid of passion. The system was not designed to be kind, but it was designed to be orderly. And in the chaos of a collapsing front, that order, that predictability, became a strange and unintentional form of mercy. The monster they had been trained to fight was nowhere to be seen. In its place was a machine, and they were simply another batch of raw material being fed into it. The machine had human operators, but their actions felt scripted, their emotions muted by the scale of their task. The women began to attach names and faces to the process, observing the cogs in this vast apparatus. There was Margaret, the nurse. Her focus was on the physical. She watched the American medics. One of them, a tall man with glasses, was treating a German prisoner's leg wound. Margaret's internal monologue was a running commentary, a professional critique. His gauze is sterile, wrapped in paper. Ours came in a cardboard box, always damp. She saw him use a small, disposable syringe of morphine, a self-contained unit he pressed against the man's thigh. One dose, clean, fast. We had one bottle, one needle for a dozen men. She wasn't thinking about compassion. She was analyzing technique, inventory, and supply. The American medic's kindness was less important to her than his efficiency, which was a direct product of his equipment. His competence was underwritten by an industrial base she could scarcely imagine. She saw him give the wounded German a cigarette after dressing the wound. The gesture was small, but the cigarette was a Camel, fresh from a pack. A luxury beyond comprehension. Then there was Zofia, the telegraphist. Her mind processed the world through signals and systems. She sat on the damp ground, tracing patterns in the mud with her finger, her ears filtering the ambient noise. She was listening to the American radio traffic. She couldn't understand the words, but she understood the rhythm, the protocol. The call and response was crisp, constant. They never stopped talking, she thought. The channel is never dead. She knew that continuous transmission meant power. It meant batteries that didn't die, generators that didn't need to be hand-cranked, and a command structure that was always connected. She watched a GI unspooling a telephone wire from a large, heavy drum, connecting a field headquarters to a forward position as casually as a woman hanging laundry. They lay wire for a one-day stop. We saved our wire for a general's bunker. This wasn't just an army. It was a public utility company waging a war. And there was Alona, the young idealist, who was trying to make sense of the ideological collapse. She focused on the small interactions. She saw a guard share a piece of chewing gum with a small German boy who was hanging around the perimeter of the collection point. The guard smiled. It wasn't a victor's, triumphant smile. It was a tired, gentle, almost absent-minded smile. Alona's mind flashed to the posters in her school. The posters of the American as a bloated capitalist, a monster in a top hat, dropping bombs on women and children. She looked at the young guard, who was now trying to explain the concept of a bubble to the German boy using hand gestures. The dissonance was a physical sensation, a tightening in her chest. A fellow prisoner, an older woman named Catalin, whispered to her, "They are not what we were told." Alona could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. She had been given a narrative about the world, a clear story of heroes and villains. But the story was falling apart, and the pieces didn't fit together anymore. The villain was just a boy with chewing gum. The women were observing the surface effects of a vast, underlying architecture. This system, which felt so alien and powerful, was not born of magic. It was the result of specific policies, logistical innovations, and a cultural mindset that treated warfare as a problem of industrial management. The foundation of the system was the Geneva Convention, a set of rules the American military, for the most part, adhered to, not purely out of moral high-mindedness, but because it was official policy. This policy dictated the humane treatment of prisoners of war, outlining requirements for food, shelter, and medical care. For the women in the field, this legal framework was invisible. They did not see the treaty. They saw the field kitchen serving stew that was hot and filling. They saw the medic treating a prisoner from the defeated army. Policy was externalized as predictable, repeatable behavior. The second layer of the system was logistics. The U.S. military had perfected the art of the supply chain. A concept called Red Ball Express had, for a time, supplied the advancing armies in France with a continuous flow of material. While that specific operation was over, its spirit, an obsession with getting things from the factory to the front line, animated the entire American war effort. Zofia, watching the endless convoys of trucks, was witnessing the endpoint of this global supply chain. The Hershey's bar a soldier might give to a child was not a personal treasure. It was one of millions, a tiny, edible artifact from a system of staggering productive capacity. The women were processed using standardized forms. Army Form MISY, the prisoner of war personal data sheet, was one such instrument. A clerk, likely a man who had been a bookkeeper or a student just a year prior, would sit at a folding table and ask for name, rank, and serial number. This bureaucratic act, however impersonal, was a form of protection. It registered them. It made them official entities within the Allied POW system, accountable to its rules. It prevented them from simply disappearing. The schematic metaphor for this system was not a clenched fist, but a conveyor belt. The women were placed on the belt at the point of capture. The belt moved them from the collection point to a transit camp, then to a more permanent enclosure. At each station, a specific predetermined action was performed. They were searched, they were deloused, they were fed, they were housed. The men operating the belt were not required to feel sympathy. They were required to perform their function. Margaret noticed this during the medical inspection. A doctor looked at her throat, checked her for lice, and gave her a DDT powder dusting with the same detached professionalism he would use on a German infantryman or a Polish forced laborer. This impersonal application of procedure was the system's defining feature. It was a power that operated without anger, a force that defeated its enemies not by breaking their spirit, but by methodically processing them into submission. The women were beginning to understand that they had not been fighting an army of men. They had been fighting a factory. The camp was a new world, with its own geography and its own rules. Here, the primary contrast shifted. It was no longer about the collision between their expectations and the American reality. Now, it was about the subtle and sometimes stark differences in how various groups of prisoners were managed within the same system. The most immediate contrast was between themselves and the male German POWs. The men were housed in large, open-air enclosures, vast pens of mud and barbed wire, holding thousands. The women were segregated, assigned to a smaller, separate compound, often in a requisition building, a schoolhouse or a small factory, on the edge of the main camp. This separation was a logistical choice. Female prisoners were a tiny minority, less than 1% of the total POW population in the European theater. It was simpler to house them apart. But for Alona and the others, this administrative decision felt like a shield. It kept them from the chaotic, desperate world of the men's compounds, where food was scarcer and tensions ran higher. Another contrast emerged around labor. The healthy male prisoners were quickly organized into work details, repairing roads, clearing rubble, or digging latrines. The women were generally not assigned such heavy labor. Their days were largely unstructured, a monotonous cycle of roll calls, meals, and long, empty hours. This inaction was a double-edged sword. It protected them from exploitation, but it also bred a stifling boredom, a sense of purposelessness that was its own kind of psychological burden. Margaret, the nurse, felt her skills atrophying. She wanted to work, to be useful, but there was no place for her in the camp's infirmary, which was already staffed by American personnel. The most potent contrast, however, was in the distribution of non-essential goods. While everyone received a baseline care ration, the small comforts that made life bearable were filtered through the guards. And the guards, mostly young American men far from home, interacted differently with the female prisoners. A guard might trade cigarettes for a song or offer a chocolate bar in a clumsy attempt at conversation. These were not systematic acts of kindness. They were inconsistent, personal transactions. Eva, the young woman who had felt invisible at the collection point, now found herself the object of a new kind of attention. A guard named Miller kept finding reasons to be near her, offering her candy, asking her name. It was not aggressive, but it was an assertion of power, a reminder of their dependency. She felt a new kind of anxiety, a need to navigate these personal exchanges carefully. Zofia observed this with a cynical eye. "He doesn't see you," she told Eva one evening. "He sees a girl from a movie. He's lonely." The realization was stark. Their safety from systemic violence made them vulnerable to this more personal, more ambiguous form of influence. They were no longer just prisoners. They were women, and that fact had become a strange, untradeable currency in the closed economy of the camp. The friction was ideological. Everything the women had been taught about the world, about their enemies, and about themselves was being systematically contradicted by their daily reality. The American system didn't just defeat their army. It invalidated their entire worldview. This created a profound cognitive dissonance, a mental state that was more destabilizing than physical hardship. The first assumption to crumble was that of enemy barbarism. The propaganda had been a simple, powerful story. The Allies were godless capitalists or bloodthirsty communists, driven by a desire to destroy their culture and violate their women. But the Americans they met were not monsters. They were, for the most part, disciplined, shockingly well-fed, and seemingly more interested in going home than in terrorizing their captives. This lack of ideological fervor was the most confusing part. They had been prepared to face fanatics. They were not prepared to face managers. This led to a second, more painful clash, the inversion of competence. In their own world, these women were skilled professionals. Zofia could decipher faint Morse code transmissions through layers of static. Margaret could set a broken bone with nothing but splints made from a crate and strips of a torn shirt. They possessed a hard-won competence, born of scarcity and crisis. In the American camp, these skills were useless. The Americans had machines to send clear signals and a bottomless supply of plaster and morphine. The women's expertise in making do was irrelevant in a world of overwhelming surplus. One afternoon, a guard was struggling to light a field stove, a small, gasoline-powered device. He was flooding the carburetor, swearing under his breath. Catalin, the older woman, who had raised 4 sons on a farm and could fix any engine with a piece of wire, watched him for a minute. Finally, she stepped forward and, using only gestures, showed him how to adjust the fuel mixture. He looked at her, surprised, then followed her mimed instructions. The stove lit with a clean, blue flame. For a moment, the roles were reversed. She was the expert. He was the novice. But the moment passed. He was still the guard with the rifle, and she was still the prisoner. The incident left a bitter taste. What good was competence when the context that gave it meaning had been erased? This erosion of their core beliefs raised a quiet, terrifying question, one they rarely dare to speak aloud. If they were so wrong about the enemy, were they also wrong about themselves? Were they wrong about the cause for which they had sacrificed everything? The guards' casual power, their indifferent well-being, seemed to mock the years of hardship, the patriotic fervor, the fervent belief that their suffering had a noble purpose. The Americans didn't seem to have a grand purpose other than winning and going home. And they were winning, decisively. To understand the shock the women experienced, one must understand the material reality they had left behind. Their world had been one of chronic, systemic scarcity. The American world was one of managed, industrial abundance. The evidence for this gulf was not in grand strategy, but in the small, mundane artifacts of daily life that filtered down to the prisoners. The primary piece of evidence was the K-ration. Developed by the physiologist in Cell Keys, the K-ration was a masterpiece of nutritional engineering and packaging, designed to provide a soldier with approximately 2,830 calories in a compact, waterproof box. The women, who had been subsisting on less than 1,000 calories a day for months, found the contents bewildering. Margaret, the nurse, mentally cataloged the items in a supper unit box: a tin of processed cheese or canned meat, a packet of 8 biscuits, a 2-ounce Durashin chocolate bar, formulated to resist melting, a packet of instant coffee, 3 sugar tablets, a stick of chewing gum, and 4 cigarettes. Her clinical mind assessed it not as a meal, but as a prescription: protein, carbohydrates, stimulants, morale. A complete system for fueling a human body, all packed in a box small enough to fit in a pocket. The women's reaction to the food was physical. The richness of the processed cheese and fatty meat was a shock to their starved digestive systems, often causing cramps and sickness. Zofia noted in a small diary, she kept on scraps of paper, ate the cheese. Tasted like chemicals and fat. My stomach is angry, but my body is grateful. This was evidence logged in the body itself. Another cluster of evidence came from hygiene and medical supplies. The delousing process, while humiliating, was a stark indicator of a system that prioritized public health, even for its prisoners. The women were dusted with DDT powder, a powerful insecticide. Records from camps like Augsburg and Heilbronn show this was standard procedure for all incoming POWs to prevent the spread of typhus. The Americans had the industrial capacity to produce and distribute millions of pounds of DDT. The women saw it as a strange, clinical violation, but it was also undeniable proof of a preemptive, systematic approach to a problem their own medical corps could only react to. The most potent evidence, however, was the unexpected gift. A guard, on a whim, might toss a Hershey's bar over the fence. This was not a ration bar. It was a confection. The D ration in the K ration was hard and bitter, designed for survival. A milk chocolate Hershey's bar was designed for pleasure. And then there was peanut butter. A few of the women were assigned to help in the camp kitchen, and there they encountered it for the first time. Huge cans of a thick, salty, oily paste. They had no name for it. They tentatively tasted it. The flavor was utterly alien. It was rich in fat and protein, a peasant's feast in the form of a strange, brown spread. That such a substance could be a common, mass-produced food item was, to them, a sign of an economy so powerful it bordered on the absurd. A log from a U.S. Army quartermaster depot in 1945 might list peanut butter 50,000 tons. To the women, it was a single, inexplicable spoonful that told a larger story than any newspaper ever could. The body keeps score. For weeks, the women's bodies have been screaming a single, clear message: danger. Every unfamiliar sound, every sudden movement triggered a cascade of adrenaline. Their muscles were permanently tensed, their sleep shallow and fraught with nightmares. Now, in the relative safety of the camp, the danger signals were turned off, but the body did not know how to stand down. The physical response to this new state was paradoxical. The tremors that had plagued Alona's hands in the forest did not stop. They continued, a physical memory of a fear that her conscious mind was beginning to discard. Her body was still fighting a war that was, for her, already over. The arrival of consistent, calorie-dense food initiated its own form of violence. After the initial sickness, a ravenous, insatiable hunger took hold. The women thought and talked of little else but the next meal. The pleasure of eating was so intense, it was almost painful, a sensation that bordered on agony. It was a reminder of just how close to the edge they had been. Margaret watched the others, her nurses cataloging the changes. The dullness in their hair was slowly being replaced by a healthy sheen. The sallow, gray tint of their skin was giving way to a faint flush. Their bodies were healing, but their minds were struggling to catch up. The emotional crescendo came not in a moment of terror, but in a moment of profound quiet. One night, Ilona lay on her cot, unable to sleep. The barracks was silent, except for the soft breathing of the other women. A full moon cast a pale, silver light through the high, grimy window. For the first time in over a year, she felt safe. Truly safe. The guards were outside, their footsteps a distant, rhythmic crunch on the gravel. The barbed wire was there to keep her in, but it was also keeping the world out. There were no bombers overhead. There was no artillery in the distance. There was only the quiet, the stillness, the moonlight. And in that perfect safety, she began to weep. It was not a loud, cathartic sobbing. It was a silent, racking grief that shook her entire frame. She cried for her brother, killed at Voronezh. She cried for her parents, whom she might never see again. She cried for the songs she used to sing, the books she used to read, the girl she used to be. The safety did not bring peace. It brought clarity. It stripped away the urgent, desperate focus on survival and left her alone with the full, crushing weight of her losses. The worldview that had sustained her, the belief in her nation's righteous cause, had been a shield. Now the shield was gone, and the sorrow was absolute. She pressed her face in her thin blanket, muffling the sounds. A hand touched her shoulder. It was Zofia, awake in the next cot. She said nothing. She just left her hand there, a small point of contact in the vast, silent darkness. The truth was landing, not in their minds as an idea, but in their bodies as an ache, a tremor, a flood of unstoppable tears. The rich food, the systematic delousing, the guards' casual indifference, the sheer boredom of the camp. These were all disparate data points that the women had been struggling to connect. They had been trying to fit them into their old narrative of good versus evil, of a heroic struggle against a monstrous foe, but the pieces would not fit. The puzzle required a different frame entirely. The revelation arrived not as a sudden flash, but as a slow, dawning comprehension, a thought that crystallized one evening during a quiet conversation between Zofia and Margit as they watched the sun set behind the distant watchtowers. They had been talking about the strange peanut butter, about the sheer number of trucks they saw every day, about the almost magical appearance of cigarettes and candy. Margit was trying to understand it in terms of morality, of the enemy's character. Zofia, the systems thinker, saw it differently. She looked at Margit and articulated the core of it in a single, devastating sentence. The most profound weapon they faced was not the enemy's cruelty, but their logistical supremacy, a power so vast it could afford to be indifferent. That was it. The thought rearranged everything. It was the key that unlocked the entire puzzle. The Hershey's bar was not an act of individual kindness. It was an industrial byproduct. The American capacity to manufacture and transport millions of units of chocolate was simply a feature of the same system that could manufacture and transport millions of artillery shells. The two were inseparable. This insight had immediate and chilling implications. First, it meant that their defeat had been inevitable from the start. They had been fighting a war of spirit against a war of material. It was like trying to stop a tidal wave with a prayer. Their courage, their sacrifice, their endurance, none of it had mattered against the cold, hard mathematics of production. Second, it meant that their captors' humanity was not a sign of superior virtue. It was a feature of their superior system. A system with so much surplus could afford the luxury of following the rules. It could afford to feed its prisoners, to provide them with medical care, not because it was intrinsically good, but because it was efficient. Preventing a typhus outbreak in a POW camp was, from a systems perspective, simply good management. It protected their own guards and streamlined their operations. The women's survival was not a gift from a benevolent victor. It was a consequence of a well-run administrative process. The revelation was not triumphant. It was deeply humbling. It stripped the war of its epic, romantic narrative and recast it as a brutal audit. Their side had failed the audit. Their nation had been found wanting not in spirit, but in steel production, in caloric output, in organizational capacity. The enemy hadn't outfought them. They had simply buried them under an avalanche of things. This new understanding allowed the women to connect the human-scale moments of their experience to the vast, impersonal system that had produced them. The causal ladder became brutally clear. An American political and economic system that valued mass production led to factories in places like Pennsylvania and Michigan churning out goods on an unprecedented scale. This industrial might fueled a military supply chain of staggering efficiency. That supply chain put a K-ration, complete with a vitamin-fortified chocolate bar, into the hands of a GI in Bavaria. That GI, following standard operating procedure, gave that ration to a Hungarian prisoner of war. And that prisoner, Ilona, experienced the entire global apparatus of American power as a strange, sweet taste in her mouth while sitting in the mud. The personal was a direct consequence of the systemic. This insight explained why their own resilience, their ability to make something from nothing, had ultimately been a weakness. An army that relies on the ingenuity of its nurses to reuse bandages is an army that has already lost to an opponent that can afford to throw bandages away. Margit's pride in her own resourcefulness now felt like a testament to her side's fundamental poverty. A system that depends on individual heroism in the face of scarcity will almost always be defeated by a system that makes scarcity irrelevant. The women's experience suggests that when systems of vastly different capacities collide, the nature of power itself is revealed. Power is not just the ability to inflict violence. It is also the ability to organize, to produce, to distribute, and to sustain. The American system's power was so complete that it could afford to be humane in its handling of prisoners, not as a moral choice, but as a low-cost, high-efficiency operational default. Their safety was a rounding error in the Allied war budget. This understanding did not make them grateful. It made them sober. It inoculated them against the simple narratives of patriotism and national destiny. They had seen the engine of the modern world up close, and it was not driven by ideals. It was driven by oil, by steel, by sugar, by a relentless, amoral logic of production and consumption. Zofia, in her diary, wrote a final entry on the matter. We thought we were in a battle of gods and demons. We were not. We were a small, poorly run farm that picked a fight with a factory. The system that had captured them was the same system that would now rebuild the world. And they, the survivors, would have to find a way to live in it. The memory that lingered was not the fear. It was the taste, the alien sweetness of a Hershey's bar in a mouth that had forgotten pleasure. The rich, strange saltiness of peanut butter, a substance for which they had no name. It was the physical sensation of a world so fundamentally different from their own that it felt like it had arrived from another planet. That taste was the residue of a colossal, indifferent power, a force that had defeated them not with hatred, but with an assembly line. It was the taste of their own irrelevance. The story of these women unsettles our assumptions about war, victory, and morality. It suggests that the most decisive power is not always the one that is most cruel, but the one that is most organized. It asks us to notice what changes when we view history not as a clash of wills, but as a collision of systems. If this account of survival by logistics changes how you think about the nature of conflict, consider what other stories we have misread through a purely moral lens. There are countless other moments where the architecture of power, hidden in plain sight, is the real protagonist. To explore them with us, subscribe to our channel. The next story is waiting.